Welcome. You know, every great workplace is really built on a foundation of safety and respect. So in this explainer, we're going to break down the legal framework and the key duties that really empower everyone, from new hires all the way up to senior managers, to uphold that standard.
So here's what we'll be walking through. First, we'll cover the federal laws that are really the bedrock of these protections. Then, we'll get into who is covered and the specific duties employers have to fulfill. We'll also take a quick look at how state laws can add another layer. And finally, we'll get into the really critical stuff. What happens when things go wrong, including liability and retaliation.
All right, let's start at the beginning. It is so important to understand that the protections we're talking about, well, they aren't just best practices or some optional company policy. These are non-negotiable standards, and they're mandated by federal law. Think of it as the absolute minimum requirement for every single employer.
And the cornerstone of all of this, it's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a landmark piece of legislation. It makes employment discrimination based on sex completely illegal. And what's really crucial here is that the courts have long established that sexual harassment is, legally speaking, a form of sex discrimination. So who enforces this? That would be the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC. They're the federal agency that investigates complaints, they make sure these laws are actually being followed, and they provide the official guidance for both employers and employees on what their rights and responsibilities are.
Okay, so we know the why behind these laws. Now let's dig into the who. Who, exactly, is protected by all of this? The thing is, the scope of who is protected has really expanded over time. It's not limited to some narrow, old-fashioned definition of sex. As you can see, federal law is now very clear that it prohibits harassment based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and pregnancy status. The big takeaway here is that these protections are meant to be broad, and they apply to everyone in the workplace.
Okay, so the law is established. But what does that mean in practice? What actions are employers actually required to take? This next part covers the how, the practical, hands-on steps every single employer has to follow. So you can think of it like this. Employers have 5 core duties that create this continuous cycle of prevention and response. It all starts proactively with clear policies and training. Then you have to establish formal ways for people to report issues. And finally, there's a mandate to investigate and take real, decisive action. Let's break each one of these down.
First up, the policy. A written anti-harassment policy isn't a suggestion, it's mandatory. It has to be clear, it has to be given to every single employee, and it must specifically list all those legally protected groups we just talked about. Now, one of the most critical duties is the investigation itself. The moment a complaint is made, an employer is legally on the hook to conduct an investigation that is prompt, impartial, and thorough. Just hoping it goes away or ignoring it? That is not a legally defensible option. It's also super important to remember that federal law just sets the minimum standard. It's the floor, not the ceiling. Many states have their own laws that often provide even more protections and have much more specific requirements for employers. Let's look at a couple of quick examples. California law, for instance, gets really specific. It mandates different training hours depending on whether you're a supervisor or not. New York, on the other hand, takes a broader approach. They require annual training for every single employee, period. This just shows why it's not enough to know the federal rules. You have to be compliant with your specific state and local laws too. So what happens when these responsibilities aren't met? And what kind of protections are in place for the folks who have the courage to speak up? This next section is all about the serious consequences and the vital safeguards that are built right into the law.
This quote, it's from a real EEOC press release, and it perfectly highlights the 2 major risks employers face. First, there's the liability for the harassment itself. But second, there's liability for retaliating against the person who reported it. In this case, the company got sued for both.
And that brings us to a really eye-opening statistic from the EEOC. Retaliation isn't just some side issue. It is the single most common basis for discrimination claims. You know, a lot of times it's because it can be easier to prove a direct link between, say, filing a complaint and then a negative action happening right after.
Let's be absolutely crystal clear on what retaliation is. It's any negative action, getting fired, demoted, you name it, taken against an employee because they engaged in a legally protected activity. That means you cannot be punished for making a complaint or for helping out with an investigation. Period.
And here's the most important point of all. These anti-retaliation protections are what make the entire system actually function. They are the shield. They empower people to report misconduct without that constant fear of what's going to happen to my job. Without these safeguards, problems would just stay hidden and employers would never even get the chance to fix them.
So, to wrap it all up and summarize what we've covered, this whole legal framework is built on the foundation of Title VII. Employers have those 5 clear duties to prevent and respond. Remember, state laws often add more on top of that. And the whole thing is held together by powerful and very strictly enforced anti-retaliation laws.
And that brings us to our final thought. As the EOC's own research suggests, legal compliance is just the starting line. The real goal, the ultimate goal, is to build a workplace culture where respect is just the default and harassment simply isn't tolerated in the first place. And that's a responsibility we all share every single day.